Matt, thanks for joining us for 100 Days of SEO.
It's a pleasure to be here, Brendan.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to jump right in. The question I always like to start with is, how do you think about SEO? And what I mean more specifically is, how do you decide what to prioritize? Whether that's on a personal project or any, like if you're consulting or even like working at HubSpot, how do you decide what to prioritize?
Yeah, good question. I think one of the things in SEO is there is often many different things that you could go after, right? And you can almost get stuck in analysis paralysis, digging into the things. I think we've all felt stuff like that previously. There's also things that often seem like they can potentially be huge wins and turn out to be a huge waste of time. I think that the way that I try to think about this is like, okay, what in general is the overarching goal here? The overarching goal is often not move keyword rankings, right? The overarching goal is often whether that's drive more revenue from demos that we can line up with salespeople, whether it's more increase the average order size on the shopping cart so that we can generate more revenue from our e-commerce store, et cetera, et cetera. So I think bucketing out individual experiments, if that's one of the buckets that you're going to be focused on an SEO point of view, that are going to improve something that's already existing. So an example might be we have a bunch of traffic coming to these 2 to 3 product pages that are generating a large amount of revenue. We see a little bit of area of growth. We're going to test out these 1, 2, 3, 4 different experiments to maybe move rank on a little bit of them and get them piling in more traffic, just purely from an SEO lens. Then we've got like the net new opportunities, right? We see this opportunity that we literally have nothing to build upon right now. Maybe, so for example, recent project that my team at HubSpot we ran, which was like a net new thing, was there was a bunch of untapped search volume around business templates, right? We tend to convert a ton of people that are looking for like templates for businesses in general across content, but we didn't have a whole lot of that. We had next to no coverage from a search point of view. So we built out a huge content directory that's kind of focused all around ranking for a bunch of different business templates. It's net new. And then there's the it's broken, we need to fix it bucket, right? That one often gets filled up pretty quickly with the more that you do in these two buckets. And I think the key in search is understanding which is more of a priority. Everything always feels like it's on fire, but is it truly on fire? Is it hurting you and stopping you from doing these two things? And in the reverse, if you do stuff from these two buckets, will they be less effective because something in this bucket that's broken is inhibiting that from working, right? Like, okay, we're going to roll out and localize 100 of these pages on our site that's in English into French, but our hreflang is broken, right? Let's fix hreflang in this bucket before we tackle some of the localization efforts here. It's going to be a lot more effective, right? We have crawling problems, and we've got a bunch of crawl traps that are occurring because of our pagination. But we also want to roll out this massive new content campaign. Let's probably fix pagination first so that this content campaign can actually start getting indexed better, etc. So the dependencies is one big piece, and that there's layers to that. And then I think then there's just basic prioritization. One just quick thought on prioritization. I like to start with using pre-existing prioritization frameworks. So I like to use the PI framework, which it gets renamed a million different times. There's ICE, there's like all kinds of variations, but priority, importance, ease, right? Like how much of an impact do we believe this can make, this individual one thing that we're going to do based on a linear scale, 1 to 10? How important are the pages or the assets that we're going to be touching to our overall business? And then how easy is it for us to roll this out? create an aggregate store, stack rank them. That's your starting point. And then I think there's a number of other things that come into play where it's like the dependencies, like what do we feel like makes sense to group together and roll out in one batch? And that would be like the typical way I start to think about things. So just to very quickly summarize, experimentation, building upon things you already have, going after net new opportunities, fixing problems, and then prioritization off of those three.
Awesome. That's incredibly helpful. It's also helpful that you have a framework so then you can kind of revisit that every single time. It's never like how does this feel? Because feelings, and especially, I would imagine you have a lot of stakeholders and a lot of input from people. So which I do. I mean, I work on the agency side of things, but with clients, like, there's a lot. I mean, we have our internal stakeholders, there's them, there's a lot, which is fine. But having a framework that you can continually reference and then communicate, that's interesting. That's something that I'm going to like think more about, is like, how can we better communicate with clients by like using a framework that they're familiar with versus like, well, we think this based on our expert opinion, which can be super patronizing and we don't want to do.
Yeah. And a really nice thing as well to touch on, which I didn't really touch on there, that you've alluded to, Brendan, is around stakeholders, right? What this piece does, bucketing things out like this and then having a prioritization framework, it's like a filtering system so that you can then distill the information that important stakeholders across the business or clients and stakeholders within the client's business need to take from this, right? They don't need to understand for a lot of the time. Like, I don't need to be sharing with like Brian Halligan, CEO of Hubspot, the minutia of a technical issue that we're trying to fix. Like, what Brian would want to know is like, if we invest stuff into this, what's the net result at the end of that for us? Is it, or just the simple answer to the question of, is it worth it? Right? And it's like, that helps you distill that. And it's the same with the client, right? Like a slightly different dynamic, because maybe you come to them and say, hey, we've got these 10 different things that we can do. There's also a cost attached to these 10 different things. These are the buckets that they're in. It's broken, we need to fix it, as I'm sure many people who have SEO clients, is probably the toughest sell, because sometimes that doesn't necessarily result in a net gain. It prevents a future loss, and it's a predicted future loss, so it feels even less tangible. But when you can tie that into facilitating or enabling you to do net gain like projects as a result of fixing that piece, then you can create more tangibility and explain and articulate the value of that to someone. So I think there's like a lot that happens in amongst all of this that really helps like showcase a vision outside of an individual just tactic.
Yeah, definitely. We worked with a client that was on like a 2-year just kind of downward trend of just losing search visibility and losing traffic. And just being able to kind of that first bucket, it's broken. Like our win was just like hitting a plateau before we could come back up like that. And they were like, is that really the win here? And we're like, yes, we're not going down anymore.
Right.
I want to kind of hop over to, let's talk about beginners, like people just starting out. We're kind of talking about some more advanced things. I want to know, like, what are some of the mistakes you see a lot of beginners making when it comes to SEO?
Yeah. I would say probably the most common thing, which actually ties very much back into some of the things that we're talking about here, is errors in prioritization. And I'll share a specific example that I see time and time again happen within this. And in all honesty, for people new to SEO, it's one of those situations that I think is a very good mistake to make, and kind of creates a bit of a learning curve for people that, for a lot of, no matter how much theory and content you consume and read around SEO, truly until you start doing it is when you realize the nuance involved within everything. So a big piece is often someone starts a new website. They get everything designed up, they do their keyword research, and they've researched all of that. Maybe they've started to get some of the basics and kind of feel good. And they're like, right, what I've heard is I need to follow all these best practices. I need to create kind of great content. And then if I create enough great content, I'll rank. And there's a fundamental jump from the creation of great content to getting results that is often missed. And a big part of this is like, for example, backlinks, right? Like people will try to answer a problem that happens, which is inevitably they start a new site, they create a bunch of content. They'll often say, okay, I'm going to commit to, let's just say, I'm going to publish 5 blog articles a week for the next 10 weeks, right? Like, and when you think about that, like logically, from outside of a search point of view, it's kind of a logical way to approach a project, right? Like a lot of other projects are focused on output. So then you start doing that, and you very quickly realize after 6 or 7 weeks that barely anything's ranking. Like maybe you get like semi-lucky and a few things are trickling in, but based on your expectation, it's usually always never like getting close to where you would expect it to be. So you're like, okay, what's going on here? And then what I see a lot of people do is they try to answer the problem with more volume. It's like when you think about the common cliche of the definition of insanity, right? It's like doing the exact same thing and expecting different results. It's one of the few situations with SEO where people fall into the trap of trying to just literally do twice as much of the thing that isn't working and hoping that that will then deliver results. Like you imagine that in the context of paid advertising. You spend 100K, right? And you get really bad CPA. And it's like, whoa, this is really bad. Tell you what, let's spend 200K, right? And like, you would never do that, right? And that's often the problem. And then like people will ramp up this, do 10 pieces of content per week. I'm going to do 20 pieces of content per week. There's a cost associated with this, whether it be time or cash, and it still doesn't work. And then they realize, okay, right, I need to do something different. I need to pivot. And more often than not, it's more of an authority problem, right? And maybe that's solved with like structuring out link building programs in amongst some of this and getting the understanding of when things do begin to go right and you hit that inflection point, you realize there's a number of different levers that need to be pulled. And for the different stage that you're at in a search campaign, different levers are more effective, right? The key to being great at SEO is knowing which lever to pull and when to pull it. For a website like Hubspot.com, right? Incredibly authoritative, millions and millions and millions of backlinks. And without really doing a whole lot actively on link building, even though we do still do active link building, we still get a huge amount of links. We don't really need to worry about links that much. Our focus can actually be more on the volume and output side of things, and we see results from that. Now, I start a new side project and a brand new domain. That does not work for me. And I need to like pile more in on the authority side of things and pull that lever. And then similarly, when you've got like e-commerce stores and you've hit a point where you've saturated for certain product pages, for example, saturate a lot of the net new available gains you can make in terms of traffic. You need to think now about UX conversion. How do we like squeeze more out of the visits that we're getting to turn that into a conversion metric? So I think that's the big piece, is understanding the lever to pull and what the levers are. And that's tough. But over enough like periods of time, you'll get exposure to different projects. The thing that I do often recommend is when you're starting out in search, try to take on maybe 1, 2, or 3 very different projects, even if they're more just passion projects, so that you can then see the nuance involved in not only which different levers to pull, but different industries, different types of projects, and they all come with their own individual like things that you'll learn from that.
Yeah, I think that last tip is especially valuable just because so many people get caught up with following the advice of people who rank number 1 for SEO or whatever. And the only SEO they've ever, I have strong feelings about this, but the only SEO they've ever done is SEO on their SEO blog, building links from other SEO blogs. And what people don't realize is that like it's way easier to get a link to your blog about search than from another blog about search, because you both get the reciprocal nature of backlinks and you're both speaking the same language. But if I reach out to, if I'm trying to build links to a client that's an attorney and I'm trying to figure that out, and I reach out to another attorney's website and I'm like, hey, here's, can we write for each other? And I'm like trying to pitch something and build a relationship. They could be like, what are you talking about?
Oh yeah.
Why would I do that? And then,
it's very tough.
And then you use the script that the SEO guru told you to use, and you're like, this script doesn't work. And it's like, well, it works for them because they're an authority, and they like all of these things. And what ends up happening is, yeah, like you said, like what works in one industry and what works for one person may not work for everybody. And I think that unfortunately, the answer a lot of times is like, you just need to do more. You need to kind of dine at the buffet of whatever you're learning and like try everything. And then you'll figure out, oh, this works here and this works there. I also like your idea about like not a phased approach, but just when to pull which lever and why. Tell me about like maybe somebody who gets that. They're maybe out of the beginner phase. I don't fancy myself an expert by any means, but I'm hoping that I'm out of the beginner phase at this point. What about somebody like me? What kind of mistakes do you see people who maybe are a little bit farther along making?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of mistakes that can be made. I make mistakes on a daily basis. I think that the key to I think like when you think about this, and this is going slightly on a tangent, so I will bring myself back, but where this is something I find particularly important, a measure of like development and tracking your own progress, whether that be in search or any form of learning. I feel very strongly that measuring the number of mistakes you make is not a very good measure of development. I think that you could make the same number of mistakes continuously, or that number of mistakes could rise continuously, and your level of knowledge and development can increase alongside it. And if I'm honest, that's often the case. Now, the thing that you should track is like how good you are at taking learnings from mistakes, right? Like you can make like 100 mistakes in 1 week, right? And then you can make 100 mistakes in the second week. The thing that isn't acceptable is to make the same mistake like twice or 3 times or 4 times. And you do that a lot at the start because you kind of can't quite isolate out what really it was that you specifically did that is not quite working. And that's why talking about when people are just getting started, they'll have the answer to a solution with the existing problem of the mistake in the first place. Your goal is, okay, I need to be able to become very good at knowing what I've done wrong. That's what I spend most of my mind space doing, whether that's from an SEO point of view, a broader marketing point of view, from a leadership point of view, all of these things, right? And like, that's when you develop a kind of what I would kind of call like especially in SEO, it's like the intuition of an SEO. It's like, particularly great people that I've surrounded myself around and tried to absorb knowledge from, they can look at things and they may not always be right, but they can get a general feel for stuff. I'll find every now and then, I'll just look at certain scenarios and be like, I'm not 100% right now. I'll look into this, but I kind of have a feel because I made that mistake before, right? And some of the things that I see with people that are more developed and have become, starting to get past that beginner phase is they fall into the trap of trying to avoid problems and mistakes as opposed to like embracing the art of failure and actually then taking those learnings and applying them. And then the second piece, which for those people that do become better at doing that, I think that with SEO in particular, probably more than any other area within marketing, I would make an argument for, it can very quickly become all-encompassing to you, right? It's like you go down this rabbit hole of knowledge in search, and there's so much nuance to it, and there's this strange dynamic in search where you can truly never statistically prove really anything that you're ever right? And it's interesting. That's why there's so many SEO experts, right? Like I can never truly prove to like the nth degree that like, even backlinks are what causes like rankings, right? Like I pretty much know that is exactly the case, but I can never truly prove this because I don't have the exact details of Google's algorithm, and no one will. That's like the beautiful thing about search is you've got to find the answers, and there often isn't just one single answer. But what happens then is you become so focused on search and heads down on like testing and trying to make these things work that sometimes I find people lose sight of the end goal. And coming back to one of the things we were talking about earlier, right, is like when you talk about prioritization, why are you doing this specific experiment in SEO, right? It's like you're not doing it to just raise rankings. You're not even doing it just to gain traffic. Like in the grand scheme of things, you're not even necessarily just doing it to create conversions, right? Like there's something beyond this, and it's like understanding the wider vision of everything you do and how search plays a part in all of this. A lot of people in search fall into the trap of like, instead of saying like, hey, there's this like really fundamentally wrong flaw with things like our copy, with our conversion. You speak to people like Joel Kletke, like a really interesting person that I always love to work with, who's much more knowledgeable than me in UX conversion copy. And he thinks in a very different way to someone who is like doubled down as like a very technical SEO person, right? Who will naturally have a bias towards solving a problem with a technical SEO fix, whereas maybe Joel will start his path with like, what's wrong with like the UX, the conversion? How can we get and break down this page from that layer? I think the key here is being able to begin approaching a problem with an approach that is just agnostic to SEO and like factors in every other variable that can be at play here. If you're not comfortable with your level of knowledge in like being able to solve the problem that may not involve like you tapping into a skill that you are really strong in, work with people that can, bring people in and like learn from them and then apply that for future projects. So I think that's like the big piece, is like trying to ensure that you become well-rounded, objective, and don't just try and solve problems that lean into your core skill set.
Yeah, the more I look at like advanced people that I consider to be my superiors is maybe the wrong word, but people who are farther along than me, and I'm seeing exactly what you described, is that like they are really good at some other things too. And what's interesting is like, if we're really honest, like all of that other stuff affects search. Brand affects search, UX affects search, like it all matters. It just depends on, like we talked about, like the different levers that we can pull and when and why. So this has been extremely helpful. Thanks for coming on 100 Days of SEO.
Been my pleasure. I love talking about this stuff. Thanks for having me on, Brennan.
Of course.